I'm Al McFarlane. Welcome to The Conversation with Al McFarlane. I'm glad to be here and glad to have you along as well. Today is Monday, June 5th, 2023. And as always, I promise a great program, a great show for you. I call it Robust Conversation, and that's exactly what it's going to be. Topic, an important one, a major legal action undertaken by one of our legacy institutions on in the interest of fairness and equity in housing in Minnesota. We're going to be talking with my friend and colleague Alfred Babington Johnson, who leads the Stairstep Foundation and its allied organization, His Works United, and one of our community leaders, former legislator and educator at the University of Minnesota, Myron Orfield. We're talking about the lawsuit Stairstep has filed against Minnesota Housing Finance Agency. Before that, let me invite you all to support this work, support this program. And the way you do that is go to the YouTube Insight News MN channel. Now, we're streaming this program live across several platforms. We're at the Insight channel on YouTube. We're at the YouTube channel for Black Press USA, the Black Press of America. We're also streaming live on Facebook for Insight News, Facebook for Al McFarlane, and Facebook for Black Press USA. And we are streaming live on Twitter, streaming live on LinkedIn as well. So a lot of ways to connect. We appreciate you wherever you are. Let us know where you are. Drop a note in the comment section. Say your name. Say where you are, and say hello to people. But most importantly, during the course of the program or after, go to the Insight News channel on YouTube and subscribe. Subscribe, like, and share. Help us grow our audience. We're trying to get to 1,000 subscribers, and you can be one of them. You can also help us by getting 10 of your friends to subscribe as well. Well, finally, the other piece of business I want to do before we begin the program is to remind you that the Minnesota Health Department wants you to know that COVID-19 vaccines are free because we want you to stay safe. COVID-19 vaccines are free. So listen, let me bring in my guest, Alfred Babington Johnson and Myron Orfield. And I want to just jump right into it. First of all, gentlemen, brothers, good afternoon. Welcome to the program.
Good afternoon, Al.
Well, it's always great to be with you. Both of you, you do so much in advancing the wellness and health and civic engagement and economic opportunity for our community by challenging systems and processes that work against us. And that's what you're doing now. So, Babington, let me ask you first just to talk about the lawsuit Stairstep has filed. What is it? Why is it?
I certainly want to do that. But Al, you mentioned even as we came in that the Minnesota Department of Health is interested in people really understanding that COVID is still a threat and that getting vaccinations is an important thing. And so Stairstep does vaccinations each week. We'll be doing this week. Today, actually, we're at the St. Paul Opportunity Center. Tomorrow, we're at the Salvation Army. On Wednesday, we're at Higher Ground Shelter. And on the 8th, Thursday, we'll be at the face-to-face safety zone and at New Salem during the course of the day. So anyway, we subscribe to the notion that this pandemic, or at least the threat of it, continues, and we want to do everything we can to keep our community safe. And so, the suit.
So, yeah. Well, let me preface that a little again. You know, you're saying that Metro Council, the state, and Minnesota Housing Finance have knowingly caused and exacerbated residential racial segregation in Twin Cities by excluding affordable housing from wealthier white neighborhoods, potentially violating equal protection rights under the Minnesota Constitution and the Human Rights Act. So let's start with that frame to explain what you mean and why have you moved to act as you have.
Well, I'm grateful that my friend, brother, in arms. Professor attorney Myron Orfield is with us because we began this journey almost a year ago. Al, His Works United, as you know, is a collaboration of African American pastors from throughout the state of Minnesota. We've been coming together since 1995. The point being that we want to serve our community, build a social infrastructure that will allow our community to be able to mobilize against issues of import, whatever they might be, health, wealth, whatever it might be. We meet once a month. And so about a year ago, our brother, Myron, came to us and helped us to understand some of what the goings on in the affordable housing arena. So we were disquieted to the point, and after hearing again and again and further substantiating those things that he shared with us, we moved to this suit. But I think he would be the best able to give the backdrop, if you don't mind, Myron.
Sure. In 2014, the Met Council abandoned a very good housing plan that required that all of the suburbs, whether they be white or black, or rich or poor, have to provide for their fair share of affordable housing. And in 2014, they sort of changed the system to let the very white and affluent neighborhoods off the hook and decide to concentrate all the affordable housing, or the vast majority of it, in either the poorest parts of the city or the poorest parts of the suburb. Now, Gary Cunningham was on the Met Council this time, and he was very strongly opposed to this. But he didn't have a majority at the council. And over time, we've seen the consequences of this. He encouraged me to reach out to Babington to follow this up and to make sure that if a challenge was going to be made, it had to be made within a certain period of time about this pattern. Another thing that's happening is it's a very huge business, affordable housing, and it provides almost 8,000 jobs in the not-for-profit community, and it's about 80% white that have those jobs. And there's very strong affirmative action provisions in housing law. And under many provisions, it says the most strong affirmative action provisions that exist in the country, and they really are not paying any attention to this. So there's 2 points. One is the whiter, more affluent places have really been left off the hook for affordable housing. And the second thing is the huge amount of economic opportunity. The $1 billion housing bonding bill, for example, has no real strong affirmative action provisions. And most of the people that are building and developing this housing are white, and they live in affluent neighborhoods.
Go ahead, Babington.
Yeah, so there's 2 or 3-fold concern. One is the availability of affordable housing. That is a deep, wide concern, and it goes far beyond even what we're focusing on in terms of segregation implications, what have you. But the issue is housing ought to be affordable for people. It ought to also be available for people. So regrettably, what has evolved is that what's called affordable housing that is subsidized, that is kind of regulated through the Met Council and Minnesota Housing Finance Agency with their resources, has increasingly been crammed into areas where there is the lowest income, where the highest level of poverty. And so there's the situation that kind of builds on itself when you take more and more affordable housing and put it in areas of that are already poverty areas or low income areas that don't receive the kind of services that are generally available in more affluent areas, that don't receive the kind of school opportunities that are available in more affluent areas, that are not areas where you have food deserts. So when you start to cram all these things together, you have a buildup of negative impacts. And so we're desperately concerned about that. And then the other thing that Myron alluded to is the economics of this entire situation. I'm grieved when we have all kinds of discussions around what they call the social indeterminants of health, for instance. And when you delve into the social determinants, at the foundation level of them is the issue of economics. People that are less resourced are less resourced. And so when you have the economics that follows issues, in this case housing, there's an opportunity there to start to attend to the underlying issue of poverty by more adequately and equitably allowing participation. That too is not occurring. And so I want to though suggest, Al, that Myron say more, Myron, about the pattern with the Met Council and Minnesota Housing Finance, how they were at some point very strong in their enforcement of issues and their support of affordable housing, and this slide that's occurred. Can you say more about that?
Before you do, Myron, let me ask you a question that's kind of intuitive or counterintuitive, Babington. On the one hand, you are saying that it appears that all the affordable housing is being built in communities that are already poor. Is there some logic that says that's who needs the housing? People where they only have rent options, or does affordable housing include renting and home ownership? So the question is that a logical place to invest the energy is in the neighborhoods that you described as marginalized at the moment, versus moving that into communities outside of where the problem exists?
I guess, Al, I think that the core issue is who deserves housing? Everybody. And are we then creating gulags? Are we creating areas where poor people have to only live here? That's counterintuitive to the notion of this grand opportunity that is the United States of America, the land of the free, the home of the brave, and where everyone has a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That shouldn't mean that at some point you're prescribed to only have take a look at life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness from the dark side of the planet. It ought to be wherever you are, there ought to be an opportunity for affordable housing. And so I think there's I don't know, there's some sort of disconnect, I think, Al, and I think we are disposed to kind of come to the question that you asked, which seems as if we're saying affordable housing ought to be everywhere, that in some ways we're saying that it shouldn't be in North Minneapolis. That's not what we're saying. It ought to be everywhere, including North Minneapolis, including Edina, including all the other more affluent areas.
Hello?
Hello?
I can hear you, Babington.
Yeah, I think you, Al, did we lose you?
He froze, so if you don't mind continuing with the discussion.
So, Myron, would you go ahead?
Yeah, I think so. I think that it's the lawsuit and Stairstep is not saying that affordable housing shouldn't be built in poor neighborhoods, it's just saying not all of it should be. There should be a balance. And that, one of the things, the people that are building the housing right now are building very expensive housing. And I think that if there was a little bit of diversity in terms of the manufacturers, in terms of the developers, you could build more affordable housing just by getting the cost down a little bit. And you could also employ people that need jobs and people that need careers. I think a big part of housing finance in the United States, community development, the community development objective is to employ to the maximum extent feasible, says the law, people that live in poor neighborhoods, people that have experienced historical disadvantage. And pretty much everybody that's building this housing is affluent and white and lives in white neighborhoods, which is contrary to what the statute suggests.
So, Myron, could you say a little bit, though, about how this evolution with Met Council and MFHA?
Oh, sure. I mean, in the 1970s, you had this period of pretty good civil rights. Walter Mondale was the author of the Fair Housing Act. We'd had great civil rights leaders like Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins come from here that shaped that act. And we had a system that we started in the 70s where the Met Council actually said to every suburban community, if they wanted roads or sewers or parks, they had to have affordable housing. And they, for about 15 or 20 years, built a large share of affordable housing in white suburbia. And it was controversial at first, but people got used to it as part of the obligation of being a metropolitan citizen. If you wanted sewers and roads and freeways from the Metropolitan Council, you needed to build affordable housing. And then in the late 1980s, the low-income housing tax credit came in, and it was complicated. And the people that had built it in the central cities, who were tending to make quite a bit of money, wanted it back. And the Met Council, the funding system that was supporting this system, was taken away and not coordinated anymore, and no one really fought it. And so in the 1980s and 90s, we also had decisions by the Attorney General that started to really undermine the strength of our civil rights law.
The Attorney General of the United States government or of state?
Of the state government. Skip Humphrey in 1998 issued some opinions that said things like integration might be illegal. They might be illegal affirmative action. And it was sort of shocking. And we started to really abandon civil rights guarantees, first in schools and later in housing, that had been really fundamental to our idea of civil rights. And I think people thought that civil rights, from things like affirmative action and things like racial integration, were too controversial anymore, that they couldn't be part of the Democratic Party. And I think that really led to a big erosion in civil rights across the board. We have very bad mortgage lending discrimination that no one's doing anything about. We have very bad treatment by real estate agents of African-American home buyers that people's not doing anything about. The housing, obviously, we've stopped engaging the white suburbs. We've allowed a lot of things that are really contrary to civil rights law to occur because we thought it was bad politics for a long time, and it's really hurt people. We see the consequences in some of the greatest racial disparities in the country, in education and health and wealth and incarceration. A lot of this really stems to the idea that we stopped enforcing our civil rights laws in the late 90s.
So Myron, you're saying at one point when Gary was on the Met Council, there was some controversy there, some determination to take a different tack. Can you say a little bit about that?
Yeah, one of the things, I think Gary and I have been long friends and allies, and we both wanted to make sure that the strong commitment of the Met Council to ensuring housing would be everywhere was there. And that he didn't have a majority. I think overwhelming the council were, all of the lobbyists from the builders of affordable housing who really preferred it to be in poorer neighborhoods. And so the civil rights objective sort of fell by the wayside. And Gary was very concerned about that. And I was too.
Was there a pivot point? Was there actually a time in which there was voting on the Met Council?
Yeah, there were a lot of things. It happened in stages. First, the Metropolitan Council approved a very segregated housing plan on the Central Corridor in St. Paul. And that was a first step where a civil rights community was opposed. And that
When
step,
was that?
This was in 2011 and 12, where they passed the plan. And in this case, Yusuf M. Jenny and Nathaniel Khalik wanted to participate in this housing plan because at the same time St. Paul was going to neighborhood schools. And the project, it was called the Big Picture Project, and it later became a housing plan that was adopted by the city of St. Paul and the Met Council. They said that schools were relevant and they wouldn't allow them to testify. So that was really the first thing that happened. Then there was a second corridor, the Southwestern Corridor, and this happened a little bit later, where they built a segregated housing plan on the Southwest Corridor and placed a lot of the housing in poor parts of Minneapolis and in the poorest parts of St. Louis Park and Hopkins, really in the Hopkins School District, in the most high poverty areas. And denied a project from Minnetonka, that would have built a project in a very white area, and didn't really engage in the others. Then there was a fair housing equity assessment, they got a grant from the Obama administration to do a fair housing plan. And in the fair housing plan, they abandoned fair housing. And that was the third activity. There were many steps along the way. And finally,
when you say they abandoned fair housing in the housing plan, can you share?
Well, they were supposed to talk about, the idea of the Sustainable Communities Grant. And this was a grant the Obama administration had created that I was involved in helping set up when working at the Obama administration. They got a special grant to do a region-wide fair housing plan that would guide their rules. And they created a region-wide segregation plan that really concentrated all the affordable housing along very poor areas. And so that was another a piece of the puzzle where they used a fair housing grant to create a non-fair housing system. And then finally, all the other things led to a kind of a comprehensive abandonment of the 1985 Fair Housing Plan, which is a really good one. There's a lot of steps along the way, but civil rights people were trying to participate at every level. Almost all of the community efforts, though, were the housing developers. I mean, the housing developers and all the community boards, it was full of housing developers, and they were taken to be the community. And when they were really interested in building low-income housing in poor neighborhoods, that was kind of their business model.
So this kind of evolved,
yeah,
because a momentum began that was contrary to some very, very constructive work done by the Metropolitan Council earlier.
Yeah.
And so then a kind of a standstill, and then almost a reversal.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things I think that people have kind of known is that sometimes central city affordable housing can be expensive, and developers have been figuring out how to make a lot of money building housing in the central cities for a long time. And I think these developers saw a way to layer more subsidies on top of one project than they'd ever seen before. So it was very good business for them to layer a lot of subsidies and make a lot of money. And it's harder to build in whiter neighborhoods. Usually have to go to meetings, usually have to go to half a dozen meetings or more to do that. So I think the developers didn't like that very well, and they're very powerful. And I think people also decided that civil rights, I mean, I think in the Clinton administration, people started to tell Democratic politicians that affirmative action was bad politics, that integrated neighborhoods and fair mortgages, fighting on behalf of Black people was bad politics for the Democratic Party. And I think they kind of took that advice, unfortunately.
Sorry that I was away for a second.
Can't hear you, Al.
Technology dropped out on me. Hold on. Can you hear me now?
Very faintly.
Okay, so how about we can just continue with the discussion? You guys are doing well. We're going to work with Ms. Al getting him set up, and you guys can just continue for now, okay?
Okay, so let's go to the issue of for me, a core issue that I know Al has a very great interest in and has been a proponent of for some time. And that's the issue of where the real solutions to the challenges that occur for Black people are. And that is not in the governmental agencies, but ultimately in the community itself. And so one key part of this whole suit is to move towards community empowerment and community capacity building. So there's certainly the desired outcome that agencies such as Minnesota Housing Finance and the Metropolitan Council return to more aggressive efforts to secure affordable housing universally. But it ought to be done in a way also that really allows the community to come to the economic table and be empowered, both in terms of resources, but also in terms of building capacity in the community to address a variety of issues, housing being one of them, both in terms of affordable housing for renters, but also for building equity and wealth going forward. So so as we're talking, hopefully at some point, about remediation, those are areas of real concern, both the access of housing, universally affordable housing, but also the equitable inclusion of African American and other communities that are disadvantaged economically in the mix. Yes.
We still
can't hear you, Al.
How about now?
Nope.
On my system.
Can just barely hear you.
Let me try one more thing. Hold on. Try a different microphone.
Okay, so while Miss Al is getting his mic together, so what do you feel like are the next steps? Like, what do you? I know you guys have filed the lawsuit, and the lawsuit, if I'm not mistaken, is in process, correct?
The lawsuit was filed about 2 weeks ago, and kind of interesting, Yasmin. Um, uh, Again, as I said, we've been discussing this for some time, but we really feel quite fortunate that we have a law firm that is taking the suit for us, that is a nationally recognized law firm uh, with, with great reputation and good resources, because there's no way that we could have brought this case and expected good outcomes, um, coming against all of the power and the depth that there is in the state and the agencies and the law firms that they could bring to the table. We're grateful for that piece.
Right. So we're looking at this at the organizational level. But I know I often am a big believer is how do you get community engagement, right? And we always talk about when we're speaking, especially when we're looking at national elections, we have, you know, a big push to, go after to vote for the president. And oftentimes what I'm learning is that at the local level is really where we make a real difference. So what is happening at the local level to get the community involved, to be behind this, and to really, um, I know you guys are doing the lawsuit, but what are we doing? What's going on at the other end to get community involvement to really kind of push this issue?
Well, that's the critical part of what we're doing.
Mhm.
This is the community. So if we hearken back to the days of the modern civil rights movement, it was the Reverend Dr. King and the Reverend Andrew Young and
Mhm.
Ralph Abernathy and Jesse Jackson and etc. It was those who had this natural community leadership position as pastors
Mhm.
and their congregants.
Right.
I remember I grew up in Knoxville, Tennessee during the civil rights era, and my sister and I, at the age of 14 and 15, went to jail picketing the Bijou Theater in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Mhm.
But the movement was being led by the pastors, and I remember so almost with a certain nostalgia that almost every Sunday uh, afternoon, after having gone to church,
Mhm.
we would come to a mass meeting, 3 to 4 o'clock. My God. And we would learn there what was happening in Montgomery, Alabama, in the bus boycott there. And we would take offerings in Knoxville, Tennessee, to send down to Montgomery, Alabama, that the people there might be able to be energized and resourced to continue the struggle there. But the unifying factor was the African American church.
Yeah.
It has that history, and His Works United is about the African American church and pastors, and so the church has that rich history. It is also, Yasmin, it's ubiquitous. Everywhere you look, we got a Black church.
Yes.
Storefront here, a cathedral there, whatever, but we're everywhere. Regrettably,
Mhm.
from the time of the modern civil rights era, there's been a couple of things happening, Yasmin, and you as a I'm going to call you a younger person.
Thank
Uh,
you. I'll take it.
you're notwithstanding Fisk University, for which I applaud you mightily, but there has been a secularization
Mhm.
that has occurred in our society generally, and it is in that I call it a cancer of sort, has certainly taken its roots also in the African American community, and in large measure, the history of the past has been pushed aside. The relevance, the sense of relevance of the African American church has been pushed aside, and we are left here kind of adrift without the historic institutions being at the battlements.
Right.
And so what we're doing in this case, and what we continue to try to do with His Works United,
Mhm.
is to demonstrate that the African American church represents an extraordinary potential for education, and mobilization in our community to take on issues. We intentionally are doing this as Stairstep and working with His Works United, both to get the good outcome, but also to have the community understand that we have this tool that we ought to be using in any number of ways going forward.
Okay, so let me actually, and that's actually great. And I'm actually going to kind of pivot and actually kind of ask Professor Orfield the same type of question, right? So one of the things is we're looking to get the community, and you are literally at the forefront of working with students, cultivating young minds. What type of things are you sharing in your classroom to really show that the value of these type of movements, and what are you saying to your students to say, hey, you know what, you guys need to really consider when you're going into your fields that these type of things that are going on in our communities need to be at the forefront of how you move in the world?
Well, I have a class that's called Equal Protection in the Civil Rights Acts, and it's about the three Civil War amendments that are passed after the Civil War ends, but how they are almost meaningless until 100 years later, Dr. King and a large group of church leaders began to press the country to fulfill the commitment. And so we've talked a lot about how the Dr. King's work in Birmingham and the tremendous social pressure that he put on there and the news led to the enactment of the 64 Civil Rights Act, which was the first great Civil Rights Act. It never would have happened. It took 100 years, and Dr. King really forcing the country to do that. And so the Civil War amendments aren't even enforced until 1964, 100 years later, and then only after Dr. King really forces the issue with a broad group of interracial churches and labor unions and so forth. And then he moves to Selma with the large civil rights movement and pushes for a Voting Rights Act, which has huge impacts. Both of these have huge impacts on the whole country and make them meaningful. Then his final campaign was in Chicago in the 1968, in 1966, when he pushed Chicago for fair housing. And
let me bring you in. Give me 1 second. Thank you. So we're going to actually try to bring Miss Al in again. Hopefully that works well. If not, we're going to continue with this amazing broadcast. It's just filled with a whole lot of information, so much needed. Miss Al, it's all yours. You're muted, sir.
So that first. How about now? Can you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
There we go. Well, let me first of all apologize to you, Brother Babington, Brother Myron, to our audiences, but also thank Yasmin for being such a phenomenal and professional communicator and journalist and organizer. I've been watching this wonderful conversation take place, anxious to get in, and just angry that my technology failed me, but that happens from time to time. Listen, let's keep going, and as you all were talking, and you may have said what I'm going to ask you already, I think it's okay to say it again. What's the end game? What does this lawsuit seek to produce in specific change for residents of Minnesota, the people that you are filing the suit on behalf of? What particulars are you looking to achieve?
Al, there's three things. First of all, the idea that there would be a renewed commitment on the part of the Metropolitan Council and Minnesota Housing Finance Agency, with the levers that they have, a new commitment to make sure that all of the communities in the metropolitan area now take the responsibility of making sure that there's affordable housing available in their locale. That's one. Two, that African American people now would really have a greater access to the economic resources that fund affordable housing at hundreds of millions of dollars.
But let's go back to one. Let's go back to number one. I want to dig deeper on that, sitting up for a minute. How do you ensure, is there a requirement, a law, a incentive, a penalty for a community not taking on what is perceived to be a fair responsibility and engagement on the question of affordable housing? How do you see that happening?
I was going to ask Myron see, why MFHA, why the Metropolitan Council? They've got tools. So Myron, would you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, when it was working really well, the Met Council and MHA worked together. And the Met Council would give communities goals, and then they'd allocate some of the housing resources so that the communities could actually achieve the goals. And the communities were told that they were not going to get access to park money or sewer money or new highway money unless they cooperated. And so the Met Council would set goals. It would review the land use plans. The Met Council had the ability to review the zoning plans to see whether there was room for apartment buildings and other types of housing. And they had a whole package. They'd say, here's the goal, here's the housing, and you have to do this if you want to get park money or sewer money or road money. And it worked pretty well. And I think what's happened now is they've just decided to give these communities the park money and the road money and the sewer money. And the Met Council doesn't have the kind of ability to move the tax credit, which MHFA could do more. And the whole package is kind of fallen apart. And I think in part because you've got all these really powerful housing developers who like to build only in poor neighborhoods pretty much. And they become kind of rich doing it by layering subsidies.
And so why have housing and the Met Council fallen off the wagon, fallen off the edge on this? Is it intentional or lack of attention, or is it strategic positioning by the moneyed interest?
I think, and Babington can talk too, but I think that, I think parts of the Democratic Party decided that this was too hard. It was too controversial back in the late 90s to try to enforce this kind of rule. I don't think it was. And I think other places in the country continue to do it, like Portland, Oregon, and Montgomery County, Maryland, which have similar kind of racial makeups. But they decided it was too hard. And then you had all these profiteers who came in, and they would hire lots of white people that looked like urban liberals. And they said, no one wants to live, Black people want to live in any place but Black neighborhoods. They don't want to live in white suburbs. No one ever really did. And we should build all these units. By the way, we'll charge 30% more than any place else. They don't say that, but we'd like to build them in these neighborhoods. And I think it became the easy way out, because citing affordable housing in a whiter neighborhood is always a little bumpy. I think it got better as people got used to it, but it was never easy.
Go ahead.
You have more to say on that, Myron. I know, but Al, there's a two-edged sword here in terms of the argument. And I served for 10 years as a Minneapolis Public Housing Commissioner at the time that there was the discovery of the land that much of public housing was on had deteriorated. It seemed there was rationale around tearing down what was, I think, was Sumner Olson. It was the public housing in North Minneapolis and moving folk away. And for a period of time, I was really caught on the horns of a dilemma about that, because I felt that in one way, it's unfortunate for all Black folk to sort of be in this area where there are less resources and whatnot, but there was a potential for political power in the aggregation. And so I'm thinking, well, and you take Black folk and you move them everywhere, and now we've dissipated our power. Mm-hmm. So I mean, it's not a totally simple issue for me. However, when you come down to looking at the negative impacts, when you look back through the rearview mirror and you see what's happened to people's lives as a result of not having access to the best schools, not having to live in food deserts, etc., you see this terrible outcome, social determinants of health, if you will. So it's important to take this issue on, one, that people ought to have a right to affordable housing everywhere. And if I choose to live in North Minneapolis, as I do, but if I want to live in Edina, I ought to have that option. There ought to be alternatives there for me, because I want my kids at that school district or whatever it might be. So it's a discussion with some nuance to it, but that's an important piece.
You were saying that was number one. Number two, you were going to focus on the economics, and exactly. That's where you said really you can discover the making of any problem or solution. What about that?
Yeah, follow the money, right? So you're certainly correct, but I'm just saying there's an opportunity. There's hundreds of millions of dollars.
Billions.
Huh?
There's $1 billion housing bill just passed.
Okay, there you go. The price of poker went up. So the point is, why do we have to have our nose stuck pressed against the window pane on that when we are the poster children for the allocation of funds and the jobs that are created, the developers that get to work, and the construction companies? Why are we excluded from that? That is number two, that we need to make sure that there's economic equity in terms of this industry, the affordable housing industry, and Black folk. And I want to throw number three in, Al, and that is, again, for me, community empowerment and capacity building. We ought to be able to demonstrate, by virtue of seeing dirt go in the hole, that effective organizing and mobilization in our community leads to better outcomes. And so then we continue to utilize those tactics to achieve better outcomes.
And so using the courts, filing the lawsuit, again, I just want to keep reemphasizing or bringing back opportunities for you both to say how using this lever will open the change that you're looking for or lead to substantive, specific, measurable change. So let's say it again. The court will do what?
Counselor?
Yeah, I think one of the things is the laws in Minnesota, the civil rights laws were created by not only people like Hubert Humphrey, Moultrie Mondale, but people like Whitney Young and Roy Wilkins and Clarence Mitchell were here and helped shape the Human Rights Act. And it's a powerful law that's never really been defined by the courts. We have a very good Supreme Court. A couple summers ago, they made a sweeping decision that opened up our Equal Protection Clause and made it stronger than the federal clause. So we've got very good law that was created by some of the great Black civil rights leaders in the country that's never really been defined because we've depended on federal law. We've got a Supreme Court that's very strong on this. And we've got also a U.S. Supreme Court that's moving in the opposite direction, that's likely to outlaw federal affirmative action this summer and slice down huge parts of the Voting Rights Act. So we've got a good court, and we should establish rights there because they're going to disappear on the federal level. And we've got really good statutes that were created by great Black civil rights leaders and white civil rights leaders dozens of decades ago. We should use it.
So walk us through the laws and the statutes one more time. What are we going to? What statutes and laws will we be using to effect the change that we are seeking?
You have the Equal Protection Clause of the Minnesota Constitution, which is a more powerful equal protection clause than any other equal protection clause in any other state. You can prove a violation of the Minnesota Equal Protection Clause using a disparate impact cause of action, which is unavailable anywhere else. We also have the Minnesota.
So what does that mean? Explain that.
I wanted to try to hit that as a layperson.
Okay.
What Myron just spoke to, because that's what we see happening with the federal courts. It used to be that when you had discrimination of one kind or another, you could just demonstrate that that discrimination occurred by looking at the facts of the case. There are more people who are not being served. That's the facts. These are the statistics. That's the disparate impact. That would be enough. The United States Supreme Court and the trend of legislation led by the Republicans is that it's not enough to just show disparate impact. You have to also show intent. You have to show that they intended to do it. That's a much higher bar to reach, And so what Myron has shared with us is that in the state of Minnesota, we still have a shot at making the case through disparate impact and not necessarily trying to prove intent. Is that so, Professor?
That's right. You said it better than I did and faster and less technically. That's right.
And if we succeed, does that run us up against the opposite direction of the federal courts right now?
I think we have to be very careful in the way that we create our remedy. We have to. You have a very good lawyer, Will Studi. I hope you can have him on sometime. He's an African-American great lawyer, came from Minneapolis, is now practicing a major partner in Washington, but grew up here and so knows what's happening. But I think we have to make sure that whatever remedy we agree to is one that the Supreme Court won't try to destroy. is they've been trying to destroy civil rights remedies in all sorts of states under state law. So lucky we have some good lawyers to do that, but we have to be careful.
So I interrupted you just to get clarification on that point. You were naming several of the tools or ordinances or laws that we are going to use to effect the change. So please go ahead.
The Equal Protection Clause of the Minnesota Constitution we talked about. There's also the Minnesota Human Rights Act, which is very much like the Federal Fair Housing Act, but hasn't ever been really delineated in court. And it looks like it has more strength in some ways, we hope that it's true, than the federal law does. And particularly, it'll have at least as much strength as the federal law used to have before the Supreme Court started weakening it. And the Supreme Court is actively weakening all the civil rights statutes. So we think it's at least as strong as the federal civil rights was at the very height of its power, and probably better. But it's a bunch of statutes that haven't been used because everyone's relied on the federal courts for so long because they've had strong or better civil rights laws. And now people are starting to use these state laws because the federal laws and the federal rights are disappearing.
Al, can I ask an opinion question of you and Myron?
Go ahead.
And it relates to what we've just described about the fact that obviously the United States Supreme Court has increasingly become conservative with the new appointees and has rendered decisions that have caused political upheaval. Okay. I'm wondering, though, in light of the controversies that have been revealed with Justice Thomas, and to some degree, even the Chief Justice, and I think one of the other justices, that kind of are public indications of corruption, to use the most crass term. I'm wondering if you think, Myron and Al, do you think maybe they might be a little cowed, both having clearly lost some elections because of some of their last decisions, but with this corruption thing, do you think that might actually produce a little more trepidation on the part of the court in terms of some of the things that they're doing?
Myron, what do you think?
Well, I think it's hard to know, but we'll find out pretty soon when they decide the affirmative action case. And if they wipe out affirmative action, they won't be too cowed, and that's what the argument looked like. Another thing is, people got to yowl when the rights go away, and women are yowling about abortion, and they're going to probably get rid of affirmative action this summer, and they're probably going to gut Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, so that there's no obligation to create Black congressional districts or Black legislative districts. And these are huge changes, but they'll get away with them if people don't scream about it, I think. And Black voters are important. I mean, it's clear, more and more clear, that Black voters in swing states are deciding presidential elections and important elections. Places like Georgia, Black voters decide that case. In Michigan, if Black voters voted better, Michigan would be a stronger case. Ohio, Black voters could make the difference. Pennsylvania, Black voters, particularly Black suburban voters, could change that state. So, I mean, we haven't had an election where Black voters have been as powerful in terms of presidential elections since the late 1940s and early 1950s, when they could really, in a lot of these swing states, if they turn out, they can make the difference. So Black voters are suddenly, worth people paying attention to. In the 1990s, Democrats were saying, being nice to Black people is too controversial. It hurt us with white working class voters in the suburbs. Well, I think that calculus has changed.
And so for me, gentlemen, I think the issue is massive over-information, over-education, over-mobilization, over-communication in our community. Our need, from my point of view, is to be very intentional about creating not only real knowledge, real information in ordinary people's minds, around ordinary folks' dinner table, but creating that in a way that in total, there is what I call a public mind, a new concept of who we are and what we need and why we need it and how we will do it, how we'll get it. But we have to tell that story, and we simply cannot wait for somebody else to champion what we must champion ourselves. And we have to do this work of championing decency and propriety and fairness and civil and human rights with the belief that what we stand for is the best for all human beings,
Amen.
even those that are our adversaries. And we fight their ignorance and ignorance in us with an aim of creating a better human being out of each and every one of us. That's what I think. But it takes us using the tools that we have. I submit Insight News, Black media as one of the venues to create and consolidate a public opinion, a public mind in our community.
So Al, I know you're running out of time, so let me add this in terms of the public mind. I want to make everybody aware that on June 20th, that's a Thursday, Stairstep Foundation, His Works United, and Omicron Boulay are going to be presenting a film at Fellowship Missionary Baptist Church, 6 o'clock, called Two Trials. And what it does is recounts what happened with the killing of George Floyd here in Minnesota and the killing of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. Interestingly enough, a historical paradox or parallel in any event, that we had a Black attorney general here in Minnesota, and there was an appointed Black attorney general in Kentucky.
Mm-hmm.
And this film kind of traces the movement of both the cases with George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and the actions of both attorney generals, and makes your point, Al, about the importance of an informed electorate to make choices that move us forward and don't move us backwards, notwithstanding the color of the skin of the actor. So I want to invite you, Al, and everybody, Thursday, June 20th, Fellowship Baptist Church, on the north side of Minneapolis, 4th Street, 3355 4th Street, Two Trials.
Well, Babington and Professor Orfield, I want to both commend and highlight, elevate the fact that you have taken the legal action. We talk a lot in our community, but we sometimes fail to take the talk to the point of action. And what you have done, I believe, in a way that is exemplary and necessary, is demonstrated direct action in the court system. It demonstrates a faith in the court. It demonstrates a faith in the system. It demonstrates a faith in the possibility, but it also demonstrates our right and our responsibility to use this tool and every other tool to pursue freedom and economic opportunity, fairness, equity, justice in our community and in the world. And so I really want to commend you, and I want to say that I'm looking at this as the model. How do we win here and keep winning?
Amen.
Win one, let's win two, then win three, then win four, and modify as needed, regroup as needed. But our intent has to be to win, and this is one of the steps. What do you think, Brother Babington?
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more, Al. One of the challenges that we have is we end up accepting an impotency. We accept the fact that nothing will ever change. So what difference does it make if I vote? What difference does it make if I protest? Well, we've got to do things that allow people to see some dirt going in the hole so they get motivated to continue the fight, to move on to the next issue, whatever. So I agree with you 3,000%.
So Myron, you mentioned liberals. Liberals theoretically are our friends, but sometimes they're not, because on the one hand, the proponents of this concentrated housing in our community, I think, could be people who thought they were doing the Lord's work by putting good housing, cheap housing in the quote unquote ghetto. But the backside of that was you were perpetuating poverty and lack of access. How do we break through the paternalistic arrogance that our friends exhibit? Because I think therein lies a lot of the problem. I say that pointing that to MHFA, for example, and the Met Council, people that think they're doing God's work, but it's killing us.
Right, that's right.
I need to add from Myron to also, the thing you said is assumption, Al, that they're doing cheaper housing or less expensive housing. That's not necessarily the case. Speak to that too, Myron.
No, they're building. I mean, the housing that they're building in the poorest neighborhoods is about 30% more expensive than the same unit in the white suburbs. And, and particularly in places like Dakota County, they're building the units for half as much, and they have rents of $600 in Dakota County, whereas in Minneapolis they're building the unit for close to $600,000 with rents of $1,200. And so it's a very profitable business for the private companies behind that. And then you have the non-for-profits that are kind of the intermediaries, and they are liberals, and they fill up Democratic caucuses conventions with affordable housing advocates who are mostly white, and their livelihood mostly depends on building this very expensive housing only in segregated neighborhoods, because that's the business model. And they have to build a certain number of units per year to get the fees and that generate the income of this. And it's much easier to build in a neighborhood where nobody's opposing it, and where there's big, heavy profit margins, where there's big budgets and lots of room. It's much easier than if you're going out, building in a white neighborhood and having to go to 12 or 15 meetings and not being able to double dip in all the public subsidies. The developers don't like that. We should change the system. Another thing is these organizations should be led by people of color, and particularly in building the housing. There's the strongest aspirations of any federal and state laws for affirmative action in these housing programs. The legislative history, says that if there is such a thing as affordable housing, it has to reach its apex in the development of affordable housing at community institutions. You can't, these programs were not meant for white people to manage poor neighborhoods. They were meant to empower people in poor neighborhoods to get good jobs and find a way into the mainstream economy.
Listen, gentlemen, what a wonderful conversation. What important work that you are doing. What important work that we are doing together to build community, to make change, and to make meaning out of the promise of democracy, of equality, of freedom, and of opportunity. I want to thank you both so very much. I want to make sure that we keep this conversation going. You mentioned your legal team, Myron, or a lawyer who's from here. Love to get him on.
Yeah,
Babington, you mentioned that this is being done because you have the support of a well-heeled legal organization, right? I want to go into that. So I think we need to sort of unpack and show our people how we create relationships that deliver value for our community. Well, listen, thank you so very, very, very much. It's been a great conversation. We'll keep checking back to keep up to date. Thank you so much. I'm Al McFarlane. This is The Conversation. We'll see you tomorrow.